some market perspectives for what we are seeing with the Deloitte in the marketplace. But also, as you can see here, we have representation from all the stakeholders except for BC government, and they couldn't be here today. So they have given me the exclusive right to speak and say whatever I want today on behalf of BC government, and I'll take the full opportunity here. So first of all, BC government, along with their partners here, is very pleased to have participated in this cross-border study. And BC government released the hydrogen strategy in 2011. So they have been chipping away at this for the last 4 to 5 years and prioritizing policies to de-risk investment, foster innovation, and support the development of hydrogen hubs in the region. Specifically speaking, BC has got a couple of key advantages. It's got a clean grid capacity to begin with, abundant water resources and access to tide water for export to Asian markets, and also critical infrastructure to road and rail and all these critical hubs to be able to connect and move the hydrogen and or hydrogen derivatives. What BC government is now trying to look at it is, as they look ahead, is there is an absolute critical demand for their clean energy electricity demand right now from all sorts of industries, LNG industry, data centers, AI. So they have now realized that there is a role for hydrogen and they cannot electrify the entire province. So there is a role for hydrogen, there is a role for liquid fuels, and predominantly they're looking to prioritize heavy mobility and what they can do, especially as our heavy duty trucks move across border north, south, and east, west. So what can they do for that? And second is around the generation of synthetic fuels, as BC, through the BC low carbon fuel requirement, has to generate 1.5 billion liters of low carbon fuels. And there is a role for hydrogen there to be able to play. So that's where the focus of the BC government is right now in terms of how can they expedite and accelerate the development of hydrogen in some of these critical sectors. The couple of years focus was all on decarbonization, while that is still there as part of the Clean BC review process, which is undergoing a review. However, they are now absolutely razor focused on jobs and economic growth. So anything that they touch through these fuels must address jobs and economic growth as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Arvind. And thank you all for the introductions. And I think it sets us up for a good next half an hour or so around a few more questions that we have. I'm seeing some questions come up on the Who Wrap as well. So if you've got anything that's starting to percolate, put them onto the app, or you can also shout them out if you'd like as well. We're really here to talk about partnerships that cross those borders. You can hear that there is a ton of really amazing work happening within each of these jurisdictions. And really what we're wanting to understand is what can we be doing across those borders. Chris, I think your role with the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub, already you can see on this map, the work that you're doing crosses state borders, which I know has got its challenges and opportunities there. What types of projects, is there anything that we should be doing that no one jurisdiction can build alone? What are your perspectives on either crossing into other states south of the border, or where we are now, or into BC?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question and a great point. I'm glad it's been so sort of prevalent thematically in this conference so far. I think, it would be nice if we could snap our fingers and supply and demand just existed right away. It would make a lot of problems go away. But it's not going to be so congruent or so linear. And it's got all these other externalities we've got to sort of contemplate to make it all happen. So whoever can get some hydrogen made at scale the quickest, we should try to buy that hydrogen. Somebody should try to buy it. So BC is doing a great job. Alberta has long been doing a great job. So trying to get some of that hydrogen into the United States market, if there's any commercial opportunities to do that, I think those are very good things, because when we talk about market liftoff and we talk about the future of this product and whether or not it's going to sort of take hold and survive without subsidy, we need those commercial agreements in place. We need long-term offtake contracts to be made. It doesn't really matter to me where it comes from right now. We need to demonstrate that there's some viability. So I like the idea. I like the fact that there's been so much investment north of the border. I like that Washington and Oregon and some of our states are now catching up and starting to make some of those investments. But we've got to be able to start to buy and sell this product from wherever it comes from in the simplest way, and lean into our great trade partnerships we've had with Canada for so many years. So that's really important, just one. Two, I think when we start to talk about fueling, we were talking about long haul trucking and freight mobility. there's a very, very good argument for hydrogen fuel cell trucking. Now, we have chicken and egg problems there too. We need OEMs to manufacture this stuff. We need fueling stations. And so the coordination around how we get the right amount of fueling stations in the right places and get them supplied with the right hydrogen, right? We're talking about low CI score hydrogen. I know we've kind of gotten sucked into this kind of color wheel of green, blue, turquoise, gray, white, pink kinds of hydrogen. Really, we should be talking about the lowest possible carbon intensity hydrogen. If we can source that and make sure in this region connected, and I'm really, in this case, in some ways talking about, BC all the way down to San Diego. We're working with the folks in California as well. That is a really important part of liftoff, market liftoff, is getting those kinds of relationships and those partnerships in place. So those are a couple where I think there's some near-term things that we could and should be doing to coordinate. And we're going to do a little bit of that tomorrow morning. So that's really cool too. And then just kind of all root for each other, right? There's plenty of market availability for everybody to make some of this stuff and make money. Companies should be able to make money, whether you're in Alberta or Calgary or British Columbia or Boise, Idaho. You ought to be able to make money on this. I think we can demonstrate the long-term demand. It's just going to come gradually and with some undulation, but I think it'll be there. So those are the kinds of things I think about.
Shannon, you've been working with BC now, at least for the duration of this project of the last 13 months, and getting a lot closer with our BC friends and hearing more about the work that's being done there. Any builds on projects, opportunities to cross borders with BC?
Yeah, I think generally we're really looking to start building our relationship to work with them, specifically on one of the key findings that was brought up in the report, just aligning our policies and our regulations and incentives broadly. And I think we're very much sort of at the beginning of that relationship. There's certainly precedent for Washington and BC working together on big clean energy planning and policies for other technologies, but I think that's relatively newer in the hydrogen space. And I think, an example of that and an example of some of the open long-term policy questions we still have about hydrogen are around, our individual approaches to defining and planning hydrogen from a policy perspective. For example, in British Columbia, they take a carbon intensity approach. We in Washington take an energy feedstock and input approach to thinking about, how we're designating hydrogen and approaching it. And I think, looking or thinking back to the graphic where in the long term, Washington may see itself being a net hydrogen importer, in a hypothetical, probably soon future where we're receiving hydrogen molecules and products from British Columbia or even from Alberta, something we'll definitely be interested in figuring out together is how are we going to track the carbon intensity or the environmental attributes of that hydrogen as it comes into Washington, to make sure that it aligns with our decarbonization mandates and our credit markets and things like that. And so that's just one, I think, of the possibilities, the things that we can figure out and approach together. And I think we'll talk about incentives and funding a little bit more too, but I mean, that as well. I think first and foremost, we want to make sure that, the opportunities that we're providing in Washington not only don't create friction or conflicts with what's going on in British Columbia or companies that are operating across both borders to be able to access, but, in a perfect world, amplify one another. Mm-hmm. And so I think, that broadly is a relationship we'll want to continue nurturing and, making sure that we're no longer siloed, but more actively sort of learning from one another and approaching things in alignment.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question here on the app, which I'll jump to. It's a good segue here. Somebody's asked about, do we address workforce and when does it become a priority? And I think that's a really interesting piece because we've seen, you touched on it in your intro, you've done some really great work on workforce. BC has also done that, considering hydrogen and what needs to happen in British Columbia. But I think now what needs to happen is those two things probably need to come together and say, well, what does that look like from a regional scale? How do we help each other? And can we consolidate or align on certifications for, whatever that is, if it's fixing fueling stations or maintaining pieces of equipment. But how does that come together and how do you enable each other? Can you get credits from studying at one, college or university or whatever that is in Seattle or in Washington? And then that also can be in BC, right? So bringing those together.
Yeah. And I'll just say quickly on that piece, certainly hydrogen workforce and training and preparedness is a big priority of commerce. We're currently a partner in a national project that's being funded by the Department of Energy and managed by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory to work with educational partners, specifically in the two-year and technical college space, and also forming some partnerships with labor unions to develop training for folks that will be working on hydrogen projects. And so I think those are some connections we've already made with our colleagues in BC that we're excited about. And I think looking to the future of that coordinated effort, among others that are more focusing either on the K-12 space or the four-year university and above space, making sure that we are zooming out a little bit and saying, you know, especially for a state like Washington, where there's so much connectivity between our economies and in many cases, likely our workers, like how are we setting folks up for success? And again, just finding like any opportunity possible to reduce friction.
Yeah, thank you. Yasmin, Arvind, anything else to build on projects that are cross-border?
I think, having technical. Can you hear me now? I think as you had mentioned, Ebony, I think in terms of the partnerships, you had mentioned about Montana potentially having the demand about 1 million tons of hydrogen potentially in the future, depending obviously on your assumptions. But as Shannon had mentioned as well, within that region, if there's that growing demand coming up, I think that's a partnership again, where Alberta can help, not just in terms of traditional energy supplier to the US, but also in terms of clean energy, and hydrogen is certainly something that I think we have the opportunity to do that. And in terms of the CI value, when you look at blue hydrogen, and we try not to use the colors here in Alberta and really focus on that carbon intensity instead. When you look at the CCUS to decarbonize, and also what Alberta is doing in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of the carbon and methane as well. When you look at all of that collectively, I think Alberta had a really good, strong hydrogen attribute and environmentally high-performing hydrogen, I think, to be able to be placed in the Penwa region as well, and to be exported to China. And certainly when we looked at our CI value for Japan and Korea, where they're looking at importing lots of hydrogen, we met their clean hydrogen specs as well. I also agree, I think it was mentioned as well in terms of the transportation or the codes and standards. If you're going to be building out that corridor, the refueling stations, again, I think lots of partnerships there to be developed for sure, I think. So, and I think finally, as well, as you had mentioned, Ebony, as well, I think in terms of all the studies, it's still nascent. I think there's lots of new technologies still being developed, and I think working collaboratively together on that, I think is going to be really important for us to be able to move and advance that hydrogen economy in the region, I think.
I don't think I can add much to whatever has been said. The only other cross-border initiative that I can add to is the one that Northwest Seaport Alliance has been leading on the green shipping corridor, or the green cruise corridor, which connects the states of Alaska, Washington, and British Columbia. There's a lot of cruise traffic, so I think that there is some interesting work underway, and the outcome of that can help further inform and strategize policy development to look at not just hydrogen, but even derivatives of hydrogen, where hydrogen can be used as a feedstock, for example, to look at methanol powered cruise ship. That could be one. The other thing I'll quickly add is, I mean, this is still all very much a policy-led market still. So if you look at Europe, I mean, what they're looking at is what kind of end users can we mandate, which only has a marginal impact on end use prices. So i.e. they went ahead and mandated for green fertilizers for ammonia, and said eventually the price of food or the bread or the beer will be less than 2 to 3% impact. That's a great example of a sector whereby mandating an end use can trigger an economy. So I think some sort of those kind of creative instruments would have to be looked at to be able to generate supply at scale.
Amazing. Thank you all. We're going to shift focus a little bit now to the funding. So we've heard a little bit about that already, but funding mechanisms, grants, and incentives. And there's also a question from the app, which will come into this as well. So I'm going to start with you again, Chris, because there's a question on the app that asks about the hydrogen projects on the map and how are they funded. So maybe just spending a little bit of time explaining that one again. And then in terms of being able to stack grants and incentives, how do you make the most of being able to use what is out there, what is still out there? What can you do to really make sure that you're making the most of the incentives and the grants and the funding opportunities that are there?
Good question. So just real briefly, in terms of our hydrogen hub, how projects are funded. So each of the projects is spending mostly their own capital. In most cases, not every single case, but in most cases, the federal grant that we are in receipt of, so we're in receipt of a $1 billion federal grant. Some portion of that goes to pay for a part of a project, usually around 20% only. So I notice in the bill, it says you can do 50-50. In general, our sort of value proposition to the federal government was, hey, federal government, we'll try to see if these projects can pay their own way for 80% if you can come in for 20%. And if that works for you, we'll try to make these projects go. That's in general how we have stacked those two bits of capital for this to happen. Though each project has different methods of how they are financing their own project. Some are very big companies and they can do it off a balance sheet. Some are not, and they are raising funds. They're doing project finance or they're raising funds some other way. And what has been good in general the last 5 or 10 years is that more money has traversed international boundaries for clean energy than just about anything else. Massive amounts of money from the private sector is spent internationally on those projects. And this changes and undulates over time. And certainly over the last 6 months, let's say, you can look at LinkedIn or whichever place you find your news and see that there have been projects dropping out and hydrogen investments have been decreasing recently. So there's a little bit of undulation in terms of how everybody's looking at this globally. But in general, that's how our projects are funded and financed. And I will just note, as we get into, I think, the second part of the question, why is it so important? What incentives are so important? So in our case in the United States, this grant funding was critical. It was catalytic. It got everybody off the sideline. I already referenced the fact that $7 billion of investment yielded nearly another $50 billion out of the private sector. Money that was sidelined or going to something else got unlocked to get spent on this. What a great thing that a government can do to try to incentivize this investment. But the second thing the government did, the United States government that is created these energy tax credits, clean energy tax credits in the IRA. So 45V is the section of the code that we refer to for the hydrogen production tax credit. What a great thing. When we talk to our partners in Europe all the time, where we talk to them all the time about sort of the development or the progress of their projects, we were the envy of everybody. So we had some money on the front end to help supply, and then we had some money on the back end to help demand and lower the cost of hydrogen a little bit. So that tax credit combined with the hydrogen hub funding was critical and became a very integral part of the capital stack. Happy to say that despite lots of difficulty and lots of concern, we were able to preserve that tax credit in the last budget bill that passed U.S. Congress and the president signed a few weeks back. It was not so easy. The House of Representatives stripped it out, just like they stripped out most of the energy tax credits. We had to fight, tooth and nail and work with the U.S. Senate, who came through at the end. Senate Republicans came through and said, this one's important to us. We'd like to keep this one in. And I could tell you for hours the stories about talking to the Joint Committee of Taxation, which I'm not sure I knew existed 6 months ago, to try to make that case. But here we are. We still have that credit available to our companies. They intended to use it, and it is going to help us kind of get these projects over the finish line and continue to go forward. And so because of all that, it's been a breath of fresh air. It's been some wind in our sails. It's been a little more confidence that we're actually going to get these things to happen, even though the market shifts, things undulate, projects will go, projects will come. And that's what we're experiencing now, just like every other hub is.
Mm-hmm. Shannon, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. I think I will definitely, uplift what I said a little bit earlier about just like broadly how, commerce and the state of Washington are very interested in making sure that the things that we do in terms of providing incentives and funding to projects are aligned. I think obviously that the spirit of that is not necessarily that we have to or should do the same thing all the time. We still have slightly separate priorities, but we have very similar strengths and very similar challenges between our two jurisdictions. And I think, thinking about the clarity that we've gotten now on 45V, I think it's pretty safe to say that the impacts of the change of that tax credit will certainly have impacts in British Columbia and other provinces of Canada. And I think now more than ever, partnership and alignment is important. The gap analysis of the role that a state could or should play in providing financial support to a growing hydrogen economy and this concept of market liftoff is definitely different now than it was a year ago. And so I think as we get back to sort of rolling up our sleeves and thinking through what the strategy could or should be now that we have a bit of that clarity, working with British Columbia is going to be really critical, and something that I think, we're definitely looking forward to do.
Yeah, I think, as everybody was saying, I think you really need some support in a nascent industry, and hydrogen at scale certainly is still growing. So from Alberta's perspective, we certainly have a couple of funding mechanisms in place to help support that. So Alberta has the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program, which helps support hydrogen production side. On the CCUS side, we also just released what we call the ACIP, the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program, very similar, providing 12% support in terms of the capital infrastructure that's required as long as it's eligible. And that has to be stacked again with the federal incentives, and the federal government has all the ITCs, the investment tax credits as well. So again, once you layer in your provincial support, your federal supports, and making sure that they're all aligned, then we think that that helps provide some additional support. And with that, knowing that hydrogen is still developing as well, we also acknowledge and recognize that you also need support in terms of really supporting innovation and technology development. So we also have the Clean Hydrogen Center of Excellence that we mentioned, and we allocated 50 million to about 60 hydrogen projects across the value chain, from TRL, one early on in the TRL or technology readiness process. And then we also have the Emissions Reduction Alberta, which also provides some additional funding if you're later on in the TRL stage, getting ready for commercialization. So again, I think you really need that funding support across for commercial and at scale projects. And then you also need funding mechanisms as well to help support that technology development across that technology readiness level. As someone was mentioning, I don't know if it was Chris or Ebony was saying, you sometimes have to go through quite a few projects before you really get that final project really coming online. And I think we really recognize that that's really important. So again, I think that layering is very important. A province or a region just can't do it by itself. That federal support and stackability is going to be really important.
Mm-hmm. I think understanding as well when you need to activate each funding mechanism as well, because if you do it in the wrong order, unfortunately, then you may not also be applicable or able to use those funding mechanisms. So that is also something that we go into in a bit more detail in the reports, and have a use case or a case study around, a hypothetical producer and what that looks like. But Arvind, anything else to add there?
Quickly, I'll just give it a bit of a Canadian perspective. So we have a new government, a new prime minister, and we're looking at nation building projects and looking at where do we continue to prioritize and what part of the economy and regional corridors. So as part of all of that, for the hydrogen side of things, for the investment tax credit, the Canadian fuel regulation, and in BC specifically, the BC low carbon fuel standard, as far as we know as of now, they're all absolutely intact and continuing to be in place to be able to support the industry. So that's positive momentum there.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to add quickly too, obviously, I think, as was mentioned, the low carbon hydrogen economy is still very much in its infancy, and public funding plays a really important role in getting projects off the ground. And also, I think there are some interesting examples that we're hearing of in both Washington and British Columbia of projects or proposed projects that, their capital stack includes very little, and sometimes in some instances, no public funding at all. And I think in those cases, it's really interesting in the spirit of like cross-border collaboration and connection, making sure that we can sort of amplify those stories and have folks understand what are the unique conditions through which those projects are possible, and sort of get word out that way, as a means of also sort of growing momentum.
Mm-hmm. If anyone has any ideas of how to change the funding mechanisms, like if right now, as leaders within the hydrogen industry, if there's a funding mechanism that you would like to have changed, that you're still seeing some of that friction, is there one that comes to mind that anyone wanted to speak to? Or are they all perfect? Too loaded for day one, maybe, of the conference.
right, I'll take the bait. You know, I think, I mean, I have a bias here because I spent a lot of time working in economic development and thinking about how you create jobs and how you create meaningful incomes for people. So like at the end of the day, we want to decarbonize. These things are important. We know the energy systems that we're going to create in this state, in this country, in this continent are going to be critical. We've heard about this in this conference already, the demand for energy that we can't meet, and we don't know how to meet it. And we have a huge problem on our hands to try to get there. And we also talk a lot about, you know, AI is going to take all the jobs. I mean, everybody here has been on a podcast and talked about how AI is going to take over everything and there'll be nowhere to work and we'll need universal income. Well, we don't have that right now. I don't know how easy that's going to be to get. I do know though, when we talk about energy investments, new energy, we talk about whether it's hydrogen or solar or wind or biofuel or any of these great technologies that are out there, fusion, battery, you name it. We're going to need humans to do that stuff for a while longer. We're going to need to build stuff. And so robots can't do all that stuff yet. So when I think about investments that yield multiple dividends, I really think a lot about energy, whether it's the grid, whether it's hydrogen, which of course we want to talk a lot about, or any of these other things I mentioned. You know, government investing its money in these things is an investment in people and communities. It's not just an investment in corporations and profit margins, those kinds of things. It's capitalist world. We know that's how things get greasy. You can actually get stuff done. But if I think about like where the government ought to spend money, and I know there's finite resources everywhere. I think making sure we continue to talk to our elected leaders to talk about sort of the possibilities, the reasons why, the merits of these kinds of investments, because they're really, really important across the board for all the reasons we mentioned. So, you know, I don't know that I mean I have a specific sort of complaint about a specific mechanism. I just think while we have to constantly think about where we compete for precious few resources that are stewarded by public officials, we should keep making the case that these investments yield all of these dividends, not just for energy needs, but for people and humans and people that need incomes in the future. That is very uncertain in terms of how the workforce shakes out. So I think about that a lot.
Amazing.
I'll say something that we've heard from companies that are either currently or interested in working both in Washington and British Columbia specifically, though I'm sure this is the case for Washington and other states and neighboring jurisdictions, is that I think oftentimes it is not easy to even understand what is being offered, how to access them, the timeline, and really like triangulating all these things is just generally difficult. And so I think, you know, there's probably some work to be done, especially in a collaborative sense, to simply make it easy for industry to understand what is possible and be able to access them. And that's, you know, not even necessarily getting to the point of thinking like of, you know, assessing gaps and filling gaps, but even just what we have on the books right now, like how can we make it simple and easy to even understand what is being offered?
Yeah, it's a great point, Shannon. And certainly when we think about across all of these jurisdictions, if you are an innovator or a project proponent that is looking to cross those boundaries and you look at these regions, as mentioned, there's over 100 different funding mechanisms. So finding them all, where do they all live on different websites and everything? Are they still relevant? You know, in a few months, things get oversubscribed, which is a great thing. But that does change. People do max them out because they are being used. So staying on top of that is really hard work. So how do we bring all of that together and keep it real time or as near real time as possible? We have about 25 minutes to go, and there's about 30 questions that have been submitted. So I'm going to try and rapid fire a couple of these, and then I'll save the last question that I have till last. There's a really interesting one here around, of course, you know, needing to build demand. We've heard this a few times, supply and demand, chicken and the egg. We are in a part of the world that is spending more time thinking about green and blue hydrogen and the use of that within our regions. But there's a question here around to build demand, is it contemplated to use blue hydrogen or even gray hydrogen while supply of green hydrogen is being developed? So I think, you know, it's something that is possible, but maybe I'll ask the question of, you know, what are the barriers and what would need to happen to be able to unlock a different carbon intensity hydrogen to help move the needle on hydrogen uptake and technology innovation and readiness? Does anyone want to take that one?
I think if you look at a couple of years ago, there was absolutely a strong pressure on decarbonization, and people and societies and companies gravitated to the most cleanest form of hydrogen with low CI. And a few projects happened and started, and a few did not, because it is expensive, and even access to grid capacity and renewable energy was also becoming prohibitive. But I think as a sense of pragmatism is kicking in. And I think as we are realizing that that may be a longer term duration, I think there is absolutely a role for a more of a higher CI hydrogen in the short term, if we can certainly scale up end users and then look at practical ways in how you can decarbonize that. I think it's a good example in the petroleum industry whereby you have the gasoline and then you can have other forms of industry.
I think from Alberta's perspective, I mean, I think, as you mentioned, all forms of hydrogen is important. We just have to be able to build that technology. But from Alberta, we've been producing hydrogen for a very long time. We have the CCUS, the pore space for carbon sequestration. So blue hydrogen is a natural fit. We're already building the CCUS pore space for our oil sands, for other emitters as well. And we've been having CCUS for over 10 years. We have 2 major commercial CCUS projects. So again, I think in terms of that blue hydrogen, again, I don't like using the colors, but I think Alberta is just, we're naturally there to be able to provide already a decarbonized hydrogen. In the meantime, I think, again, continuing with the technology development to really bring the costs down for green hydrogen, I think is going to be really important.
Mm-hmm.
I think from Washington's perspective, we have really ambitious decarbonization targets. And I think from both the perspective of that and also, what we hear from our communities and our residents and our voters as we think about, the future of our low carbon economy and some of our environmental and community values that we have, we're really interested in the technologies that are both commercially available now and really soon commercially available that leverage, our state's strength of clean power, clean feedstocks, clean inputs. And so, obviously acknowledging today, we do have fossil fuels in our economy and we will continue to for a while. I think it's really important for us to think about this transition as, doing sort of the right thing from the start. And so that's what we're really interested in investing in and focusing on now.
Perfect.
I mean, these are not easy things to try to contemplate. I mean, I think like across the board, everybody here probably has, some sort of incentive or motivation to make sure the economy is improved or is stable or maintained. And we have these goals around decarbonization, and sometimes those coincide and sometimes those don't intersect exactly correctly. And so we make choices, right? Like we want to decarbonize, but we're not going to tell everybody you can't pump gas anymore. Like that wouldn't work. So, we make choices about how we go about doing this. There are some really great technologies out there that are sort of blue hydrogen by the definition of the color wheel that we sort of have been using that are carbon negative. Well, that's interesting. Like we should be thoughtful about that. So if we start to think about what the CI score and reducing the number of atoms of CO2 that go way up into the sky and go around the world and are the cause of climate change, then we should be thinking about sort of holistically, how do we make sure we achieve the best possible outcome to reduce the most amount of those all molecules going up in the sky? How do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that achieves some of our economic goals too? So, we're going to have different kinds of hydrogen produced for a little while. So as we think about market liftoff, should we think about how do we get sales going? I think we should. Should we do that in whatever the most responsible possible way we can to make sure it's the least amount of CO2 that gets produced? Yes. And should we also think about the symbiotic relationship of all these different industries here, right? Should we think about sort of carbon capture, use and storage? Should we think about using that? So as we think about making SAF, how do we make this combination work that achieves the best yield? So they're not easy questions, but just in the battery industry as well, we want EVs. EVs are great. EVs decarbonize, but we certainly couldn't hold everybody to account to make sure that every single EV charging station in America comes from a green power source. That would be hard. It would be hard. But we get the market going, and there are a lot more EVs out there, right? We're doing a good job there. I think it's going to work in the long run. But these are the things that we have to, the machinations of, how many eggs can you afford to break to make that omelet? These are tough discussions, but it's the right place to have them. And so I hope that we can be thoughtful about them in the context I just provided in terms of what we push forward and what we try to get into the market.
Thanks, Chris. And this session ends at 4, so we only have 3 minutes to get through the next couple. So I'm going to take the most easy question that has been submitted, which is, where is the report and when will it be live? It's live now. Easiest question, as I said, of the day. So it's on the Penwire website. I believe it's going to go through LinkedIn. It's also, so that this is the BC, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Oregon one. It's also going to be on the BC and Washington websites. The Alberta report is also already live. So yeah, take a read of them. If you don't get through all 232 pages plus 170, read the executive summaries. They're quite short. They're only a couple of pages long. Rapid fire, last questions for you. What's the next step that we can take?
I'll go first. I think in Washington, we're really eager to continue our trajectory of working with industry, tribes, communities, and other stakeholders to develop our policy landscape. And I think the three things that we're really interested in focusing on are permitting, the availability of affordable clean power, and of course, the third one is slipping my mind. Oh, building demand. I think those three are the big things that we're thinking a lot about.
From Alberta's perspective, like I said, we've got 4 years of our hydrogen roadmap. The landscape has changed, so we're going through right now what we call a hydrogen revisit, or just updating our hydrogen strategy. And with that, similar to Shannon, I think we're looking at the next step. We've really focused initially on that supply, that production side, and I think we really need to spend a bit more time on that demand side, creating that demand. It's always the last thing, but I think it's becoming more and more important now, and how we go about creating that demand is going to be very important and next steps. But at the same time, continuing, I think, with that technology and innovation development is still going to be important, and the collaboration and the partnerships, I think, still going to be very important, and continued work with the universities to really understand again, how the landscape is changing, bringing the cost down. When you're looking at all the technical in transportation and hydrogen, in terms of all the technical brittlements, all of those, I'm not an engineer, but all these technical nerdy things that need to be done.
I think I'll speak on behalf of the BC government. For them, the focus right now is on interprovincial corridors and cross borders, interprovincial like Edmonton, Calgary, Edmonton, Prince George, and then of course the cross-border to BC and Washington. So looking at anything that they can do to look at a shared infrastructure, harmonize codes and standards, and more importantly, look at systems and how can technology and learnings and data be shared, I think will help accelerate the development of the economy.
Here on demand signals, we need to policies or investments that shore up demand, very, very important as we talk about market liftoff. But the one I'll just add is, and it's from my own experience, regulatory process, we have to be able to prioritize building stuff. And we talked about, you heard about it in the earlier conversation on sort of grid and interconnection queue and making sure we get all that transmission built where we need it, when we need it. For all these energy projects, we've got to be able to build them faster. I've worked on many, many projects in the state, and one of the main reasons that sometimes we don't land that really big project, that really cool project that ends up at some other state, is because at the end of the day, it was going to take too long to get that permit. And so I'm not saying we sacrifice sort of the standard by which we want to protect the environment. The standard is a good standard. We should be proud of that standard. But we got to make the stuff happen quicker. We just do, because companies don't want to wait that long and they'll walk. So that's an important one for me.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you to all of our panelists who have been up here with me today, and I think they all deserve a little round of applause. Thank you so much for being here today. There is so much excitement, although there is some uncertainty. I think we're really in a great spot within the Pacific Northwest to really drive this home. The next session is starting in about 15 minutes, so we'll all still be here. Stay in this room if you want to learn all about sustainable aviation fuel. And yeah, thanks for your time.